welcome to the Budding Business Podcast. My name is Ryan Greer. I'm co-chair of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's National Cannabis Working Group. And with me is Nathan Mison, my fellow co-chair of the working group. Nathan, here we are. Welcome. Hi, how you doing, man?
I'm very excited to be here. This is our first inaugural episode, and it's going to be exciting to talk about what cannabis is now and what cannabis can be in Canada.
Yeah, well, listen, so you got it. This is a podcast about the business of bud, specifically Canada's regulated cannabis industry, which is changing not only day by day, but minute by minute as we forge our path as the first large developed economy to have legalized recreational cannabis for adult use. So, we co-chair the National Cannabis Working Group. For those that don't know, it's a number of Canadian companies that includes producers, processors, retailers, ancillary service providers that have really been working together to advocate to governments for policies that will make the sector more competitive, create more jobs, and help governments sort of fulfill their health and safety objectives. So, why a podcast? To me, it's pretty simple. Nathan, you and I, as we've sort of built this little industry association, have spent the last 18 months having some pretty interesting and insightful conversations and exchanges of ideas with a number of industry leaders, and it kind of feels selfish to keep those all to ourselves. I don't know, Nathan, what are you looking forward to with this?
I think I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk to people who have come from the legacy market to help build the legal market, from those who are standing up different pieces of the industry in licensed production or retail or ancillary business, who are focused here domestically, but abroad as well, and researchers and people that are pushing innovations. I think for us to show how dynamic and exciting this sector is really exciting. And I look forward to bringing some of these incredible people that make up our sector to your listeners and to the Canadian Chamber members and hopefully Canadians as well.
Yeah, well, listen, why don't we get right into it and go to our first podcast? We had a couple of great guests. We sort of started this thing by looking back at where we've come from, talking a bit about where we're going. I really enjoyed our conversation. Why don't you let folks know who we chatted with?
Today, we are welcoming one of the people that helped provided the framework for the cannabis regulated environment in Canada, Honourable Ann Mcclellan, who was instrumental in standing up the Cannabis Task Force and creating the regulatory environment that we know and activate and work within today.
Excellent. And we also had Eric Foster, who is cannabis practice lead at Dentons, one of Canada's leading law firms. And Eric is also helping us out at the National Cannabis Working Group by leading our own review of the Cannabis Act, something I think we'll be talking about a lot in the months to come. So, why don't we get to it? Thanks for those who are giving us a listen. Today's podcast is sponsored by Diplomat Consulting. It's presented by the Canadian Chamber, and let's go to our conversation with Ann and Eric. Well, I'm really pleased to welcome the Honourable Ann Mcclellan to the podcast. You will know her from her distinguished career in politics, where she served as the Liberal Member of Parliament for Edmonton Centre and held the posts of Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Minister of Health, Minister of Justice, among other portfolios. Ann has joined the law firm Bennett Jones, where she provides national and international strategic planning and assistance to the firm's clients. She is an officer of the Order of Canada, recognized for her leadership and dedication as a politician and law professor, and for her contributions as a community volunteer. And most importantly, for the purposes of our discussion today, she was the chair of Canada's Task Force on Cannabis Legalization, which really laid the groundwork for Canada's recreational adult use regime. Welcome, Ann.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to introduce a lawyer at Dentons, Eric Foster. Practice at Dentons focuses on cannabis law, corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, both public and private, regulatory compliance, and emerging companies. Eric routinely acts as counsel to both public and private issuers and security dealers and with a particular focus on the cannabis, life science, mining, real estate, and technology sector. Recognized by the Chambers Canada and Legal 500 as one of Canada's leading cannabis lawyers, Eric has been tapped to lead the Canadian Chamber of Commerce review of the Cannabis Act and lead its consultation process. Thank you very much, Eric, for joining.
My pleasure. It's an honor to be here with such esteemed colleagues. So terrific. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Welcome to our inaugural podcast of the National Cannabis Working Group. Honourable Ann Mcclellan and Eric Foster, we're really excited to have you here and talk about the review. Thanks again, guys. So let's jump right into it. Can you tell us about yourself and your entryway into cannabis policy? Perhaps, Ann?
Well, as Ryan has indicated, my early career in politics was all on the enforcement side. It was all on making sure that either the criminal law, when I was Minister of Justice, or, Federal Minister of Health, working through the vagaries of the beginning of medicinal and what was legal and what wasn't and what the courts required. Then as public safety minister, again, I was on the enforcement side. So you can imagine that when Prime Minister Trudeau appointed me as chair of the task force on legalization and regulation, not everybody embraced my appointment with joy and enthusiasm because they remembered me from my time on quite literally the enforcement of the side. Held those three key portfolios, justice, health, and public safety. I guess the Prime Minister and others thought that with that breadth of experience, I might be able to bring something to the task force. As the PM moved forward with his commitment and the government's commitment to legalize and regulate. And what we discovered is that a lot of people, as we carried our consultations through, had forgotten the second part of the Prime Minister's commitment. And it wasn't only about regulation, but the PM talked all the time about strict regulation. So we always had to keep bringing people back during our consultations to the fact that, yes, we're on the track to legalization, but there's also going to be a strict, in quotes, regulatory regime that goes with that to meet the public policy purposes of the government. So that has been my involvement in this space. I guess I would say it's a circuitous and somewhat unusual route to end up being a proponent of legalization and a defender 2 years in of legalization and the regime that was created.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. My entry into the industry certainly is not as historic and groundbreaking, of course, as Ann's, but no, effectively, I've been working in the industry almost exclusively for the last 5 years. And my background is actually as a corporate commercial securities lawyer. But this is something that we started getting a lot of questions about 5 years ago. And it was people were originally coming at this just as an economic opportunity, which I know is something we're going to talk quite a bit about today. But that then led into the whole conversation around how is this going to be regulated in terms of if you're looking to raise capital, you're entering into commercial agreements, what sort of barriers do you need to put up? What are those pitfalls that you're trying to avoid? So very quickly, and I know Ann works at Bennett Jones and I lead the cannabis practice at Dentons, two firms I think that are really on the cutting edge and willing to be entrepreneurial. So we jumped right into this space very early, and it automatically kind of shifted into a cannabis policy role immediately, which was a different role for me, having been kind of a corporate commercial lawyer almost exclusively for the first 10 years of my practice. And since then, like I said, we've built a big practice here, certainly one of the largest and leading in Canada. And it's been a lot of fun and definitely never a dull moment, right? And the regulations are constantly changing, whether, more also on the provincial level, but it's been a lot of fun. It's definitely kept us on our toes here, and I think it's kept a lot of law firms on their toes.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up to Ann, if I may? You mentioned strict a couple of times. I think that's a really interesting word. I think a lot of us thought and I've always wanted to ask you this question, that You make things as strict as possible because it's much easier to give things to the citizenry than take it away. Was that kind of some of the intention that you guys had discussed at the task force, and as you were developing the policy and legislation, that perhaps make it strict and then see what works and doesn't work and then change it?
Exactly. Yes, we talked about that a lot, both during our consultations and around the task force table, that as we did not know how this new industry would evolve, what opportunities might arise, what risks might arise that we hadn't identified. To your point, it's always easier to go out stricter, if you like, and then as we learn, loosen the regulations or change the legislation itself based on lived real-time experience. So that was very much our thinking, and I think that was very much where the government and the Prime Minister were in terms of, look, bold, new experiment, second country in the world at a national level to legalize and regulate, and not in any way to demean or insult the country of Uruguay. It is a country of 3.6 million people, and very few people noticed when it legalized, although we did spend time talking to them and took on board their experience. So we knew everybody was going to be watching us around the world, and we weren't sure how this was going to evolve. So to your point, we thought, let's be tougher out of the box, and then as we live and learn, we can make adjustments.
Eric, I think you summarized all of our collective experience with the industry very well when you said there's never been a dull moment. So, as we reflect on now 2 years of adult use recreational, I'd just be curious for both of you, but maybe we'll start with you, Eric, about what you've maybe been surprised by the most over the first 2 years. Certainly, there was no shortage of prognostication in the op-ed pages of every national newspaper, and from anyone else who had an opinion, positive or negative, about what this bold new experiment would mean. But I guess I'd just be curious what has surprised both of you in the last 2 years. Why don't we start with you, Eric?
So one thing I'll say, and stepping back at kind of the way this was regulated, to really be simple about it, the federal government, regulated cannabis, but ultimately left the provinces to have the discretion in terms of how the distribution of adult use cannabis would be in those provinces. And of course, and maybe this has been a boon for lawyers, we have over 10 completely different regimes. So one thing that has surprised me quite a bit is the vast difference that we're seeing in the different provincial regimes. And moreover, that over the last 2 years, there hasn't really been any effort to unify those so much. So we have completely different regimes. You look at Quebec on one side, and then you have Alberta, which is now over 500 retail stores. You have Ontario, which was originally, private, then went to the lottery system. So it's been all over the place. So the fact that the regimes around the country are still so vastly different, I think that makes it hard for cannabis companies in a lot of different ways to really grow. So I'm surprised we haven't seen more movement there and collaboration between the provinces. And that may be because no one province has got it perfect yet. So that's something I'd really like to see happen. And the only other thing I'll mention in terms of what surprised me is that there hasn't been a lot of movement on just kind of the CBD regime. We're still kind of dealing with the old industrial hemp regulations. I know actually that's something that Ann and the task force had focused on a little bit, that ultimately didn't really, I don't know if all of the task force recommendations fully got integrated into the current legislation. But again, that we haven't seen a lot of movement on the legislative front with respect to kind of the regulation of CBD alone surprises me a little bit.
Thanks, Eric. I think you made an interesting point and a worthwhile one on the different regimes. I as an outside observer and somebody who didn't know as much about the industry as both of you, as Canada was heading into adult use recreation, adult use legalization, I was quite surprised when the provinces and the federal government signed the Canadian Free Trade Agreement in 2017 and made bold proclamations about the need to remove interprovincial trade barriers. And then shortly thereafter created a whole bunch of new ones with 10 different regimes. But this always seems to be the case, which is sort of one step forward, two step backwards when it comes to how to make Canada an easier place to do business across provincial borders. So what about you, Ann? What has surprised you from your seat over the last 2 years?
I think a number of things, and certainly I agree with everything Eric said. At the highest level, the thing 2 years in that amazes me is how normal it is. There was no reefer madness, right? Everybody, and Ryan, you referenced the fact that in the lead up to that day, legalization, I remember doing media, and it was as if, there was going to be mayhem or chaos, or I don't know what people expected.
Cats were going to marry dogs, and dogs were going to marry cats. It was going to be anarchy on the streets.
Yeah, so you know what? Being typically Canadian, it was a kind of normal event. I firmly believed that the day after legalization, Canada would look very similar, exactly like the day before legalization. But for the fact, in some provinces, you could walk into a store and purchase your cannabis product, even though, as we learned, there wasn't a whole lot of cannabis available, nor a very interesting array of products in those first few months or so. So I think the normalcy of it all, the fact that there wasn't chaos or anarchy. And now I think we could all go out on the street and do a little person in the street interview, and most people wouldn't even know that we're coming up to the second anniversary, because it's actually kind of a non-event, which is kind of the way the government of Canada and the task force wanted it to be as we moved down this road. We didn't want to glamorize cannabis. We didn't want to encourage its use as a task force. But we wanted to deal with the underlying failed public policy. And you don't need necessarily a lot of streamers and parades to do that. I think you just need thoughtful public policy. And the other thing, Eric has mentioned the differences in the provinces. This is Canada, guys. Okay, we are a confederation of different jurisdictions, and clearly we as a task force took on board, as a former constitutional law professor, you would expect nothing less of me, that in fact the provinces had jurisdiction over retail and how the product ended up getting into the hands of the consumer. I do want to do a shout out here for Alberta, and in fact the Alberta regime, I believe, but it's only my opinion, has been the most successful in terms of leveraging off the existing alcohol, wine and spirits regime, where we for 25 years have had a private sector regime. And the previous government of Rachel Notley decided to use the same regime, so that they didn't do what a number of provinces have done, which is use their Crown Corp and have cannabis sales run through their liquor and gaming agency, other than for wholesale, obviously, and the Alberta Liquor, Gaming and Cannabis Commission is a wholesaler. But Alberta was able to build off that private sector regime. Everybody understands in this province that you buy your wine and your spirits in the private sector from a private shop on your way home on a Thursday night or on the weekend or whatever. And that's the form and the model the province used for cannabis. That's one of the reasons why we have over 500 stores. It's one of the reasons why we have had in our stores greater product choice, and innovation and so on. But nobody should have been surprised that the provinces would take different approaches to this based on their cultures. But I would say that I've been disappointed with Ontario. I guess that's one of my big surprises, is that they went back and forth. They had a change of government that turned the legislative public policy approach upside down. But to me, it is still unfathomable how the largest province in the country only has what, Eric, Ryan, Nathan, 50 stores or something? I don't know what the number is as of today, but it's pretty shocking. And I think once Ontario steps up and we see the number of stores commensurate with the population, a lot of other things will start to change.
Yeah, I think that's right.
170 stores. And I think that leads to I think it's a great point. Eric and I were talking about this the other day. A fascinating thought experiment is the estimate is there's between 1,500 and 2,000 cannabis stores still to open in Canada over the next 18 to 24 months. Will more cannabis retailers open or traditional retailers close? And that's a surprise to me, that I think cannabis isn't getting that attention. And the surprise in that is that, to your point, and I completely agree, is that the only people who seem to be holding on to the tropes of the past and some of that reticence about cannabis legalization seem to be politicians and bureaucrats who haven't noticed that the citizenry has moved on. And that's one of the biggest surprises for me, is that we can't change that conversation, because it's crazy. The citizens don't talk about cannabis legalization almost at all anymore. At all. It's become ubiquitous. So that is a very interesting thing. And I know we're recording, useless statistic, Anne, for you that I love. October 17th, 2018 in Edmonton, Alberta was the warmest day in 113 years. Because if you remember, it was 23 degrees. And like at those Fire and Flower stores, our lineups were stupid because it was so warm. It was like, God was like, okay, cannabis is legalized. We're going to have the warmest day ever so people can wait outside and enjoy it for the first time.
Well, you see, Nathan, I don't remember that, because on that day I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Okay.
But I think it's a really interesting point too, because I've also been surprised, and I think you're right on point as usual, frankly. But you know, the speed at which this industry has become both sophisticated but also socially accepted has, I think, taken everybody by surprise. And even just sitting where I sit at a large global law firm, you know, initially there was some internal resistance to this, but now, and it's been longer than 2 years, it's just so accepted. It is just part of doing business in Canada now. It's really that simple. And there's all sorts of, there's the medical component. It is accepted medical. It is accepted medicine. It's accepted as a part of business. It's part of your everyday life now. So it's been really nice to see, because I do think people were surprised at how fast this has just kind of been socialized with our community at large, and it has been, and it's nice to see.
I think that's a really good segue to, you know, I think you mentioned how we have the federal review, and Ontario's cannabis review launches on Saturday as well, which is an interesting thing. So we're seeing more federal and provincial cannabis legislation set for review over varying points at the next 2 years. Can you elaborate on what you think the process would and should look like for industry stakeholders, and how we can move the needle? Because to the point of the conversation that we've had, if the citizenry has accepted it, how do we make the people who influence the legislation understand that's the case as well?
So from where I sit, and I'll be brief on this point, because I'm sure Ann and probably, you know, Ryan from the chamber has an even more pronounced view on this. But in my mind, this all comes down to acting as an industry, and acting in a unified manner. There's certainly no shortage of interesting characters, and sometimes they can create in this industry, and sometimes that can just create a lot of noise that frankly doesn't resonate and isn't all that compelling. So from my perspective, you know, a combined voice is going to be far more effective when dealing with governments and trying to influence public policy, and also having that voice come from such a broad array of different ancillary businesses that are connected to the cannabis industry, right? We have to look beyond just cultivators and retailers. There's so many other industries where there is phenomenal economic opportunity for them to move into cannabis. And we've seen that already with several large blue chip multinational companies making significant investments in large Canadian cannabis companies. So being able, and you know, the work frankly that the chamber does is that's why this is so important, creating things like a National Cannabis Working Group, so that there is one unified voice that has enough industry heft behind it to actually influence policy, I think is where this needs to go if you actually want to affect real change.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what Eric said. Looking at this from the point of view of a former minister, I would say speaking with one voice to the greatest extent possible is key. The one thing that I think ministers, political staff, public servants, you know, get tired of is hearing what I call a cacophony of voices, with everybody saying something a little different and everybody with their special interest pleading. And I know how many times as minister would I say, you know what? Can't you guys get together? Can't you guys each put a little water in your wine and decide what you can come to me with in terms of, yeah, it's probably a compromise, but it works ultimately for everybody. And I can take that on board and work that through and get it through cabinet committee and get it implemented. Whereas if you come with 1,000 different points of light, let's say, actually I just throw up my hands and say, you know what, you guys need to go away and do some homework, right? And then come back and talk to me. Now, I am not saying that that is exactly what will happen this time. But I do think, to Eric's point, it's important. But you will have probably the producers with some of their issues. You will have some in the gray market who there are still too many barriers to bringing in those people who are still growing and selling in the farmers market in Nelson, BC, or wherever illegally. They might like to come into the legal market. What are the barriers to that? And because we identified as a task force, we wanted the so-called gray market. We didn't want to call them illegal. We wanted, craft, I think was the word we chose. But we want those people in the legal market because they've got great genetics, they've got great experience, and so on. And I think we probably one of the things that the government will hear about will be barriers to some of those people coming in, the costs involved, the administration, and so on. And that's the kind of thing that should be looked at. There will probably undoubtedly be those who come, retailers and producers, LPs, who talk about marketing restrictions, advertising restrictions, and so on. I mean, that's a constant refrain, although less so than it used to be. But still, I think, different sections of the industry will have unique concerns based on their lived experience after 3 years. But as much as possible, try and figure out what are the handful of things that just don't seem to be working or are barriers to this industry's development, keeping in mind that this has all been developed in a public health frame. Right? That's where the government and the task force came from. So also, there's going to be a review of medicinal 5 years out, not 3 years, 5 years, I think, although that may have got changed at committee, I'm not sure. But I still think it's 5 for medicinal. And what are our learnings there? And should we even have a medicinal strain 5 years from now? I mean, all those things will attract different cohorts of advocates, but as much as possible, to Eric's point, speak with one voice within those cohorts and figure out the big things, the structural things, perhaps, that the government could look at changing. And don't overburden the government with a bunch of petty self-interest.
I think that's great advice, and really that is one of the reasons why we've established an industry-led review of the Act a full year in advance of Health Canada's review, and why we've tapped Eric on the shoulder to help us lead that, because we think it's incumbent on industry and us as the chamber as much as we can to bring together a wide, diverse group of voices and to find the areas where there is the greatest amount of industry consensus. And I don't think that means that companies won't have their own input to the review, that will have differing viewpoints on almost every point of the legislation. But we do think that we can get a big swath of industry to help us identify what the biggest and most important issues are, and we want to get that work done early. We want to put it in front of the government long before they even launch the act, because it's too important to let this opportunity go to waste. Especially as we talk to member companies every day that they go to Health Canada and say, we're having this issue or this regulatory problem, or there's a small legislative or regulatory change that we could use, and the department says, well, that's why we're opening up the act, in 2021. And as a result, that's in many cases, Health Canada is right that might be the appropriate time to tackle these issues, but also it's created a lot of expectations within industry that that everybody's going to be able to see their singular issue addressed in this, and that's going to be tough to do. So, really, we're excited to have Eric and our members work together to find the areas that bring everybody together and where we can find consensus, because it's just too important to the future of the industry. I guess sort of related to this question, one of the things we see with almost every other industry in Canada is that various departments at various levels of government with economic mandates support those industries. And it's not uncommon to see the local member of parliament or MLA, standing in front of a facility announcing 25 new manufacturing jobs, or participating in industry economic development work with all these different sectors. To your earlier points about how the legal and regulatory frameworks have been developed in Canada. Right now, it's still almost explicitly viewed by every level of government through that public health, safety, and justice lens. And that's, probably appropriate given the amount of, caution that the government wanted to take with this. But how can the industry start to, work to have governments start to look more at the economic side of this industry? Because it is really an incredible success story when we look at the jobs that are being created, especially in some of the communities that they're being created. How do we start to work with governments to give economic mandates to departments to start to look at this industry from the other side?
I think that's an Eric question.
Sure, happy to. And again, I think you raised, right off the bat, I think it is important that we wouldn't want to deviate from the stated goals, which are admirable, right? Protecting public health and safety, restricting access to young persons, reducing the illicit production. But I do think there are ways that we can basically make what I don't even think are wide, massive changes to the legislation to unlock more economic opportunity. And again, it's a line I've always said, from my perspective, the focus really needs to be on innovation and not cultivation. We have to look for ways for Canada to be a global leader in this industry. There's, I think, a little bit of a concern that we've spent, the better part of 3 years just patting ourselves on the back and not really focusing on ways that we can advance things from an economic standpoint, not just within our own borders, but around the entire world. It's not, from my perspective at least, it's not realistic to think that Canada is going to be a global cultivation hub, right? It just doesn't make that much sense. Ultimately, as legislation liberalizes around the entire world, which is the only trend this is going, that's not going to be where Canada has a competitive advantage. So as a country, to unlock economic opportunity, we need to be increasingly focused on things that we can do really well, where we have that competitive advantage that we can export. And some of that is frankly just allowing our local national cannabis companies to achieve better financial results so they can entice more entry into the industry from other large Canadian companies that you wouldn't necessarily think would be involved in cannabis, or even other international opportunities. So in a couple of things where we hear all the time working with our clients and stakeholders, in terms of pressure points where, oh geez, this would really help our business, really help our company. Restrictions on packaging and labeling has been a hot topic, I think, since day one, and still continues to be. Whether there's a way to expand some of the descriptions on products without obviously appealing to kids, which is the primary goal of simplified packaging. Almost maybe moving it a little bit more towards the alcohol regime. I think when the original legislation was passed, the way the government approached this, and Ann, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think there were some parts of the instrument that they really focused, and they pulled stuff from tobacco law, right? And that's kind of more on the public health approach around discouraging use, heavy restrictions on branding, promotion, labeling. And then there were other elements of the industry that they kind of legislated similar to alcohol, similar to like the government-run distribution models, limited personal production uses, security checks. So, I think if there's a way to balance some of that, so for example, maybe reducing some advertising restrictions for edible products or products that aren't inhalable, to bring that specific regime more in line with alcohol. I mentioned earlier maybe some changes to allow a little bit more flexibility around CBD, because our regime here is quite different than what we're seeing from other countries in the way they legislate CBD. So from my perspective, there are quite a few things that we can do, both internally as a country to make this industry better and more successful in Canada. But again, to go back to it, our perspective from my view should be really trying to export our knowledge. That's what we have here now. We don't just have flower, because we can't grow that as cheap as we could grow it in a whole bunch of other countries. But, we have a regulatory regime here. Some things are great. Some things maybe need some tweaking, but the bottom line is it is second to none right now. And, we're already seeing lots of interest. And at least in my firm, we're engaging as a global firm, we're engaging with governments all over the world about what Canada got right and what learnings other countries can take from our regime here. So from my perspective as a country, that's really what we need to focus on to unlock true economic opportunity.
I don't disagree with anything Eric said. Just a couple of points. At the macro level, keep in mind the original frame in that the government did not want to glamorize use or encourage use, right? And we did learn from the alcohol regime. We heard unanimous opinion from the public health officers of Canada that alcohol was a failed regulatory regime. So we developed a cannabis specific, but Eric's right, drawing elements from tobacco. You see that reflected in the advertising restrictions and health warnings and so on. Drew a little bit, I think almost unintentionally, but by necessity from alcohol. So unlike a lot of other products, if you're building cars in Canada, the government wants to promote the sale of that, just as, as build as many cars and sell as many cars as possible, or parts. The government's intention was never to encourage use. So that is something that people need to keep in mind when they engage with government around the review. And the other thing I would say is that government was very sensitive to not being accused of a tax grab, right? That they were setting up this new industry and it was a new revenue line in the government of Canada. At least that was within the government of Canada. They sensitive to the fact, but I think in our consultations with the provinces as well, they didn't want this to be seen as tax grab, revenue line, like gambling or alcohol and wine spirit sales or whatever. They wanted to keep that focus on public health regime, correcting some of the failed public policy in the of the past. So where the government of Canada is in relation to that larger macro thinking, I think not clear to me that it's changed all that much, but that is something you'll have to take on board as you begin your discussions with them around the review.
There's lots of fascinating things to unpack in those two comments. I love to look forward to have that conversation, perhaps at another podcast. I think one of the interesting things about the review, that we can talk about another time is the role of three orders of government when it comes to taxation and revenue creation. I think that is an interesting opportunity to talk about where the regime might have gone in a different way. I'll share just a quick statistic from Vancouver. The most expensive business license in the city of Vancouver is $2,500, except for cannabis retail, where it's $33,000. So yeah. I think it's very interesting to have that feedback, and I think there's lots of opportunities to talk. I just want to go back one quick thing. One of my favorite pieces of branding to you, Ann, is it's no longer the gray market; it's the legacy market.
You're right. Yes.
I love that brand. The first time I heard it, I literally stopped and clapped somebody for rebranding that, because I thought that was one of the best pieces of rebranding I've heard in a long time.
Well, we called it the craft market, right? We wanted to distinguish it between, those who were in the black market, organized crime, and those who were growing happily in the interior of BC or in the eastern townships and had been growing for 20 or 30 years and knew who their customers were and all of that romanticism. I've never heard so many people talk about the love of the plant. I did not know you could love a plant as much as some of these guys do. It is actually, it is so charming in a way when they come to the consultations and admit they were breaking the law for 20 years, but then talk about their love of the plant. Honestly, it was really very charming.
I'm going to haphazard a guess that might have been in British Columbia.
It was, yes.
Yeah. I want to be respectful of our time, so I hope you guys are okay going a little bit over. I hope that's okay with everybody. So we'll try and, the conversation's been so great, I don't want to stifle it. So I hope everybody's all right with a little bit of flexibility. But what steps can Canada take to create greater economic opportunity within the sector by helping facilitate or being involved in the conversation with cannabis legalization throughout the world with the upcoming review? So as you mentioned, Uruguay was first, but Canada was the first G20 nation, and the eyes of it was really on us. But even since my own time of involvement from November 4th of 2018, 2017, we now have 56 nations on earth that are talking about cannabis legalization in one form. How do you guys see Canada leading, and what in the review can we do to see that actually be something Canada does?
I'll take some initial thoughts, and again, I think this is really topical, and it ties in a little bit to what I was mentioning earlier, because we are actually Dentons. We are, to give a shameless plug, we are the only firm that has a truly global cannabis practice. So I do see this day in and day out, and I am actually speaking multiple times a week with my cannabis colleagues in not just the U.S. and in Europe and in South America, but also in Africa and Australia and Asia and New Zealand. So this is something that's really topical, and I've met actually personally with representatives from governments and from 4 different countries that are looking to this. So people around the world are looking at Canada as leaders in this space and looking to engage with industry leaders to get ideas, to take advantage of that wealth of experience and knowledge that we have in terms of how we can actually help and work with other governments. I'm going to defer to my esteemed colleague Ann on this point, given her expertise navigating government relations.
I don't disagree with anything Eric said. I think actually the way Canada, and we did it with medicinal starting in 2001, right? We were one of the first nations to have, let me call it at least a semi-legal, if that's possible, regime for medicinal. With me as the Minister of Health at that time, having the only legal grow-op in the country, that was a very interesting time. But we were, with a handful of other nations, embracing, largely because of the courts pushing us there, around medicinal, what medicinal could look like. We all know how many iterations that went through before we began the discussion around legalization of adult use. So I think we've been a bit of an example on the medicinal side for now 20 years. I think in terms of adult use, again, what we can do is what we have been doing over these past 2 years is show that you can legalize this product and you can do it and create a new industry, and you can do it in a way that does not lead to anarchy, reefer madness, chaos, whatever, right? That yes, it takes time to build a new industry, and there will be shakeout. We've already seen substantial shakeout. There will be more. We will learn more, but that you can do this in a way that actually helps achieve a number of public policy options that are important, social and legal public policy options. And I think a lot of other countries are talking to the Government of Canada. A lot of other countries are talking to the task force, to me and others. I spent a couple of hours with the Israeli Justice Committee, who are looking at this about a month ago. We've talked about New Zealand, Australia, I mean, there is a lot happening, and you need to keep your eyes on the United States. If Joe Biden wins the election, this is not going to be top of the Democrats' agenda, right? Nobody should expect that Joe Biden is going to rush out in the first 6 months and say we're going to legalize federally. But I do think you're going to see a move, a real constructive conversation start to take place in the U.S. about legalization at the federal level, which has both opportunities and challenges for Canada if that were to happen. But I do think that again, people look to Canada to draw upon our experience and our expertise at the governmental level. But then, of course, people are looking to various aspects of this industry, specifically in terms of learnings and innovation, to Eric's point, and other things. But I think there is a lot of discussion going on and interest in the Canadian experience.
And just to even tie it back, directly to the question I think you asked, and one of the things, really the reason why we're all here today is to talk about creating greater economic opportunity within Canada. Some of that comes to positioning our largest companies to be the most successful companies in this industry. Right now, you may not see it, but I think there's no denying this is going to be a global industry, just like alcohol or tobacco or pharmaceuticals or agricultures. This is a global industry, and right now Canada does have that head start. Some of the largest, including the largest cannabis company in the world by most metrics, is a Canadian company. So, at the end of the day, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, when all the dust settles, chances are it's going to look a lot like a lot of other global industries where you do have that handful of 800-pound gorillas. Everybody's got their local, national companies. Great companies can be really successful, but at the end of the day, there are going to be a handful of very successful multinational cannabis companies. And right now, Canada has the opportunity to make those be Canadian companies. And we really have to take advantage of that. And some of that is doing exactly what Ann was talking about, engaging with other governments, helping position helping them with their regulatory regimes, and using that as a platform to help Canadian companies succeed within those other jurisdictions. At the end of the day, there's very few industries where the leading global company in this industry is Canadian. Well, we have that opportunity right now with cannabis, and it's something that we can't take lightly, I think.
I think that's a great place to leave this. And you said it takes time to build a new industry. I don't think anybody would argue that cannabis companies are still figuring things out. I don't think any level of government would argue that they're not still figuring things out. And I really just want to thank the both of you. I mean, Ann, for your role in helping Canada figure this out from the beginning, and Eric, for the role that you're taking on to help us at the Chamber put our best foot forward to help the government continue to iterate on that framework that Ann helped shape. So thank you both so much for taking the time to share your insights and experience with us.
Thank you so much. This has been fun. Eric, great to meet you.
You too, likewise. And thank you very much, Ryan. And again, looking forward to the work with the Chamber. It's going to be so important, and really can't wait to get started on it.
Just as a final note, Ann, I think you and I might have a couple of things to talk about in a couple of weeks when we get together. So
sure.
I'm looking forward to that conversation as well.
Absolutely. On the mat patio.
Yeah, if we can, that's right.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much.